Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam McCormick. I am on the social work faculty at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas, where I teach courses in trauma-informed care, child welfare practice, social work with families and individuals. And the topic that we're going to talk about today is one that is very near and dear to my heart, an issue that I have been interested in researching for well over a decade now. In fact, I think one of the first studies that I ever did on the experiences of LGBTQ youth in the foster care system was actually back in 2007, so almost 2 decades now. But this is a population that I think oftentimes gets overlooked in conversations both about child maltreatment and trauma, but also child welfare and foster care. So my hope is that we can all walk away with much more knowledge about the experiences of LGBTQ youth who come into contact with the child welfare system and who end up in the foster care system, and some strategies for really engaging and addressing their trauma in much more meaningful and sensitive and culturally competent ways. I've got a couple of objectives here, again, that I hope that we walk away from this training having a very firm grasp on. The first is really better understanding the unique vulnerabilities to really all forms of child maltreatment that we see in LGBTQI plus young people. When we look at just about every single form of maltreatment, from physical abuse to sexual abuse to trafficking to emotional abuse, family rejection, LGBTQ youth experience those forms of maltreatment often at disproportionately high rates, and we're gonna look at the ramifications and the consequences of that and do our best to kind of understand what those trauma experiences look like from the vantage point of youth. We're also going to look quite a bit at the experiences of LGBTQI plus youth as they navigate the child welfare system and the foster care system, really at every step of the way, and recognize how their experiences can differ significantly from the experiences of non-LGBTQ youth, and perhaps what some of the consequences might be when we don't recognize some of those distinctions and some of those differences in their experiences. And then finally, where we're going to spend a lot of time in this presentation, is really going to focus on trauma-informed strategies for addressing those experiences and empowering young people with voice and control and power and sensitivity. So my hope is that we're gonna do a good job in all of those areas, and we can all walk away with some tangible things that we can do both to better understand the experiences of youth, but also to serve them better in a very trauma-informed, intersectional way. We're going to look at a couple numbers here, and I'm going to give context to some of these, but I think this data is really, really important. One thing that we know about LGBTQI youth in the foster care system is there is a vast overrepresentation, meaning that if you have an LGBTQI identity, especially if you are an adolescent, teenager, there is a much stronger likelihood that you're going to both come into contact with the child welfare system, but also to be placed in foster care. So what we know is latest data, which really isn't that old, only about 4 or 5 years old, is that about 30% of all teens in the foster care system report having an LGBTQI plus identity. And that's about 3 times the rate of the general population. So the way that researchers often interpret this is that you're about 2 to 3 times more likely, depending on what study you look at, to be in the foster care population if you have an LGBTQ identity than if you don't have one. So this is really, really important for us to understand. And we look at a couple of different factors that we'll talk about really at length in this presentation to help us to better discern and understand how it is that such a vast overrepresentation exists for this population. It's in many ways it's complicated, but in a lot of ways it's really not that complicated for us to understand. So my hope is that we can get a really, really good grasp on that overrepresentation. And so one of the first things that we're going to look at, obviously, is why kids become or come into contact with the child welfare system, and certainly why they might be placed in the foster care system. And of course, that has everything to do with child maltreatment and trauma. And we know that LGBTQI youth experience just about every form of childhood maltreatment at disproportionately high rates. Family violence certainly being the one where we see the greatest disproportionality or overrepresentation. In fact, depending on what study you look at, and we have some really good ones with large sample sizes and some pretty rigorous methodology that suggests that LGBTQ youth are anywhere between 3 on the low end to 5 on the high end times more likely to experience some form of family violence in childhood. And we all know as social workers what that family violence can entail. This could be child abuse, this could be physical abuse, this could be domestic violence, a host of different experiences that would constitute family violence. But we know as LGBTQ youth are significantly more likely to have those experiences. When we look at the mental health outcomes of LGBTQ youth, there's much to be concerned about. Nearly 60% of LGBTQI youth report symptoms of depressions. Some studies, that number is even a little bit higher, where LGBTQI young people meet clinical criteria for depression. About 73% reported experiences of anxiety. And of course, in other studies, those numbers can be a little bit higher. The studies that I'm looking at here are the ones that probably have the most robust and rigorous methodology. So we know that the mental health outcomes and mental health experiences of LGBTQ youth continue to raise concern, and there continues to be high rates of disproportionality in PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders. Certainly when we look at suicide, we know that over the course of the past 5 years, that about 1 in every 3 teenagers who dies by suicide is an LGBTQI plus young person. Studies with trans youth suggest that anywhere between 50 to 60% of trans youth, and a little bit higher for trans youth of color, have had suicidal ideations or thought about suicide over the course of the past year. So the mental health outcomes certainly raise concern for us. And this is happening, of course, during a unique time where over the past, I'll say 15 years, we've seen a lot of gains in terms of acceptance and affirmation, certainly in media portrayals. We've had big Supreme Court decisions that have certainly proved to be big gains for the LGBTQI community, but we've also had a lot going on politically, a rise in anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. We've seen policies, especially in southern states like Texas and Florida, that have really targeted LGBTQI plus young people, especially trans young people. And so despite gains in affirmation and acceptance and representation in some areas and in some aspects, we're really not seeing the dial move too much when it comes to the mental health outcomes of LGBTQI plus young people, vulnerability to suicidal ideation, self-harm, and certainly representation in systems like the foster care system, the juvenile justice system, homelessness amongst LGBTQ plus young people, and then trafficking, where your identity as an LGBTQ plus young person is the most robust predictor of vulnerability to trafficking. And a lot of folks don't realize that. And we'll talk about that here in a second as well. Let's look at homelessness, because anyone who works in the child welfare system and the foster care system knows that there is a very close relationship between foster care and homelessness, especially for teenagers and alumni and youth aging out of care. And we continue to see LGBTQ plus young people being incredibly vulnerable to homelessness. Depending on your state, homelessness rates or young people who are homeless, anywhere between 35 in some states to 50% in other states of all homeless young people under the age of 24 are actually LGBTQI plus young people. What we oftentimes don't realize is that many of those young people with LGBTQ plus identities who are experiencing homelessness, who have durations of homelessness, who are couch surfing in between houses, many of them have a history of child welfare involvement. In fact, when we look at studies of specific to LGBTQ plus homeless young people, about 3/4 have some history of child welfare involvement. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of them have been in foster care. Now, a big chunk have, but they've had some involvement with the child welfare system. Perhaps their family was investigated at some point. They had a call made by a school official, right? Some involvement. When we look at the experiences of LGBTQI plus homelessness, there can be big distinctions, big differences when we look at their experiences versus homeless young people who don't have LGBTQI plus identities. And perhaps one of the areas where we see some of the most glaring and perhaps some of the most alarming disparities would be at what we call kind of survival sex. And other survival strategies for homeless young people and LGBTQ plus young people. You know, depending on the study and depending on what they were kind of looking at and how they operationalized this, are anywhere between 3 to 7 times more likely to engage in survival sex. So something like sex for residence would be a really, really common one. I was interviewing a young person for a study, and he was staying. He had run away from his most recent foster home, and he was staying with an adult, but with the expectation that there would be a sexual relationship in order for him to stay in this house and have his housing provided for him. So that would be an example of sex for residents. We see sex for substances, transportation, security, toiletries, food, all sorts of different survival strategies that we see here. So LGBTQI plus young people much more likely to be vulnerable to those experiences, which is really a form of trafficking, even if we might not necessarily think of that as trafficking. It absolutely is, and if it's a young person, that's child maltreatment, obviously, as well. When we look at durations of homelessness as well, the durations for LGBTQ plus young people when compared to non-LGBTQ plus young people on average are about twice as long. So you're not only on the streets or without a home or couch surfing or bouncing around, but those durations are much, much longer. And so what does that mean, right? You're much more vulnerable to the adverse experiences and the trauma that come with being homeless, like survival sex, violence, crime, exploitation, and all of the other experiences that we know homeless young people are vulnerable to. The other thing that is a robust predictor of homelessness, I'm actually going to skip a slide and come back to this one, would be trafficking. Of course. And we know that once a youth experiences homelessness or even is vulnerable to being homeless, that significantly raises their risk to be trafficked. And there is no population out there that is more vulnerable to trafficking, to being trafficked than LGBTQI plus young people, and especially so in certain regions, right? Depending on where you're watching this training from, this could look really different. I'm recording this training from Austin, Texas, where we have a child welfare system, a foster care system that is famously bad, but especially bad for LGBTQ plus young people. And we also have a huge problem in our state with trafficking. In what we oftentimes don't realize, especially if you were to look at initiatives to combat trafficking or to serve survivors and victims of especially youth and young adult trafficking, if you look at a lot of those programs, you wouldn't necessarily even realize or recognize in terms of how those programs are developed and how they're carried out and the policies and practices behind them. You wouldn't necessarily even realize that the overwhelming majority of young people who are experiencing trafficking in those areas are either LGBTQI plus young people or youth in foster care, and oftentimes LGBTQ plus young people in foster care. Let's do a case example here with the state of Texas, where we've actually had a lawsuit that was filed by youth in the foster care system well over a decade ago. In our state Department of Family Protective Services and our state politicians have really rejected the claims of this lawsuit, despite the fact that youth have won over and over and over again in court in terms of saying that basically the foster care system is really in bad shape and doesn't provide permanency and safety and a whole host of other things that we know are pretty part and parcel to the experiences of long-awaiting teens in the foster care system. Well, the state has really pushed back on that and really not taken accountability and really taken an approach that has basically been, well, there's really nothing to see here. Our foster care system is fine. So, even if you're pouring money into efforts to combat and serve young trafficking victims, are you really going to do so in a way that truly acknowledges that a huge proportion of the young people in your state who are vulnerable to being trafficked and who are being trafficked are youth in this foster care system that you're also trying to argue isn't so bad? Of course not. All right. So at the same time, and again, you can look at the state of Texas. We've had for well over a decade now, session after session after session, where the main issue that our state legislators has really targeted has been LGBTQ plus young people. We've had religious refusal bills for foster parents so they don't have to provide affirming and accepting care to LGBTQ plus young people. We've had a lot of anti-trans bills that have been passed, bathroom bills, athlete bill, all sorts of legislation that have targeted LGBTQI plus young people. So with the same folks who are funding trafficking programs really acknowledge that the other population of young people who are really vulnerable to being trafficked are LGBTQI plus youth, and certainly are they going to fully acknowledge the reality that those LGBTQ plus young people who are in the foster care system or the child welfare system or experiencing homelessness are really the ones most vulnerable to being trafficked? Of course not. So what I'm getting at here is oftentimes the very programs that you would hope would serve to protect and heal and create safety for trafficking victims simply are missing these populations of young people. So if you're an LGBTQ plus young people, young person, not only are you much more likely to be vulnerable of being a victim and being targeted and groomed by traffickers, but the very services and resources in places where you would go for help and support oftentimes are really not even seeing you and serving you. I did a study recently, so this is a really small kind of study, really to just kind of get a better sense of what these experiences look like for LGBTQ plus young people. These were young people who had been in foster care. All of them had been in foster care for at least 1 year, most of them for much longer than that. Some of them had aged out. Some of them had run away from their most recent foster homes. But nearly 90% of those young people experienced some form of family rejection in their family of origin, oftentimes that rejection led to why they came into foster care in the first place. Many of them came into foster care much older than what we oftentimes see, oftentimes at age 11, 12, 13, some 14, 15 years old. Nearly 3/4 of them had experienced some form of family rejection, and most of them had experienced this in multiple placements, but either in their foster home or in their group homes. Nearly 80% of them had lived in a congregate care or group home setting, and I'll talk a little bit more about this here in a little bit, but again, this could vary a little bit depending on where you're watching this from, but in most states, congregate care, group home placements are supposed to be kind of the least desirable, the last place that we would send a young person when we really have no other family options for them, that they can't go with their family of origin, they can't go in a kinship placement, they can't go in a traditional foster family home, they can't even go in a therapeutic foster home. Then they would go to a group home or a congregate care setting or a treatment center. Well, with LGBTQ plus young people, congregate care settings and group home settings in many states have kind of become the primary place that they're living, that we rely on those much more heavily than we do with non-LGBTQ plus young people. And in this study, that's a really, really good example of that. There are some much larger studies specific to the experiences of LGBTQ youth, where roughly about 70% of them had experienced a congregate care group home placement at some time in their foster care experience. In other studies that have found that congregate care group home placements were where LGBTQ youth spent the majority of their time while they were in foster care. That's simply unacceptable for any population of young people, but especially for such a vulnerable population. And I'm going to explain in a little bit kind of how that happens. In this study, 55% of the young people spent the majority of their time, so over 50% of their time that they were in foster care were in congregate care or group home settings, the least desirable, most institutional places, but also the placements that create the most vulnerability for a host of different experiences that I'll talk about in a second. The average number of placements for these young people was almost 6. So again, these are young people who lived in foster care, who at some point, either as teenagers or young adults, had been trafficked or had experiences of being a victim of trafficking. So I think that tells us quite a bit. So we know that experiences of foster care, experiences of homelessness make young people much more vulnerable to being trafficked, but it's not just those more structural, systemic experiences. There's also some factors associated with trauma and family rejection that can really compound those experiences, kind of micro level interactions, things that are going on, strategies that are used by perpetrators of trafficking, especially some of these grooming tactics that kind of land a little bit different, or that LGBTQI plus young people, especially those out of the foster care system, and especially those who are experiencing homelessness, are much more vulnerable to. And I'm going to try my best to really help us to sort this out and understand this a little bit. So first, we're going to look at some of the early strategies or tactics that we oftentimes see with perpetrators, grooming tactics of perpetrators that are grooming and recruiting trafficking victims. And then we're going to look at those through the lens and through the experience of LGBTQ plus youth out of the foster care system. So let's look at this first one. And this is the oldest trick in the book. This is one that's incredibly effective for perpetrators of trafficking, but that's to offer a young person a sense of family and a sense of community. Okay. So we know this tactic, we know it well. Anybody who works in the world of trafficking can talk at length about how perpetrators use this and as a grooming tactic and a coercive control tactic. But let's talk about how this is often experienced by an LGBTQ plus young person. So let's take one of these young people from the study that I just wrapped up. The 90%, what of the 90% of them that experience family rejection with their family of origin, right? Well, they've experienced this family rejection when they were younger, almost always due, right, to something related to their identity, their sexuality, their gender identity expression, something there, right? So they experience this rejection. Perhaps their family kicks them out of the house, or they run away from a hostile environment, or they're missing school, something that puts them on the radar of child welfare investigators, so much so that they get placed into foster care. And their experiences in foster care really only serve to further reinforce much of the rejection that they experienced in their family of origin. Maybe they're bouncing from home to home. They end up in a group home or a residential treatment center or some type of congregate care setting, which happens, we know, for LGBTQ plus young people about 70% of the time, sometimes even more than that. Well, and then they end up perhaps on the street, or they're debating whether to run away from a placement. Now all of a sudden, this traffickers offers, and again, very coercive, very cunning, very charismatic, very believable, right? Their offers of family and community are going to work a lot more with a young person who simply does not have family or community, right? I have 5 kids. I have a very close relationship. Some of them are teenagers. Some of them are young adults. My wife and I have a very close relationship. They have a great relationship with their family, with their siblings. They got a lot of friends, teachers, professors who are very involved in their lives. They have a big, robust support system that if somebody were to come in and offer a sense of family or community, it probably wouldn't land in the same ways as it would with a young person who has been rejected by their family of origin, oftentimes to the point where they've been kicked out of their homes, or their home environments were so toxic or abusive or emotionally neglectful that they ran away from them, or their foster care experiences were so bad, or they bounce from place to place to place that we never establish any type of permanency for them. Offering a sense of family now, a sense of community, a sense of connection is going to be experienced in an entirely different way for that young person. And so because we fail to provide them with that community, especially for young people in the foster care system, in the child welfare system, especially for young people who have experienced rejection in their family of origin, where over half of them, by the time they're 21 years old, for LGBTQ plus young people who age out of the foster care system, over half of them on their 21st birthday could not identify one single adult who they could rely on if they were in a crisis, whether it was a housing crisis, a mental health crisis, a financial crisis, a relationship crisis, some other crises. Over half of them couldn't identify one single person that they could rely on. We've all studied and heard about in social work these power of one studies. When you just have one adult in your life, even for young people who are dealing with a whole bunch of trauma and adversity, that just having one adult in their life serves as a huge buffer, a huge healing factor, a huge supportive factor for LGBTQ plus youth in the foster care system, especially in certain regions and certain parts of the country. We can't even deliver them that. We can't even give them that. So offering a sense of family and community, they're going to be really vulnerable to that. Same with this next one. Offering a sense of safety, housing, and protection. Again, this is a tactic that only works, or works a lot better, for a young person who does not have housing, does not have protection, and needs to be kept safe. And the reality is, especially when we operationalize safety and include emotional safety, affirmation, acceptance, authenticity, when we include that and understand the importance of safety around those things, not just physical safety from the streets or to be protected from abuse or perpetrators, we can easily understand why so many LGBTQ plus young people in the foster care system with a history of foster care involvement, or young people who have aged out or run away from the foster care system, would be so vulnerable to these tactics and these pleas and these offers to be kept safe, or these promises to be kept safe, and to be provided housing, and to be provided with protection, both emotional and physical. And then the last one, offering to meet a youth's basic needs, the needs of things like food and toiletry and housing and transportation, the basic needs that you need as a young person to get by. Oftentimes, LGBTQ plus young people out of the foster care system have huge challenges and deficits in this area, often because we simply aren't delivering the safety, the permanency, the family, the community, the connection that they would need. I have two young adult children who are both in college, both social work majors, wonderful kids out there changing the world, living on social justice, all of that good stuff. They call me a lot, and they're pretty responsible kids, but they call me quite a bit, with flat tires, with the car's out of oil, or Dad, I can use a couple dollars to get to the end of the month until my campus paycheck, work study comes through, or whatever it might be. These are oftentimes resources or privileges that LGBTQ plus young people, especially those out of the foster care system, simply do not have. So again, they're going to be much more vulnerable to that. But these are not the only tactics. Let's look at some of the more interpersonal ones. Some of the coercive control tactics that we commonly see groomers and perpetrators of trafficking, especially of young people, creating a dynamic of distrust of others, so that if I'm trying to separate you from your support system or from your family or your foster or whoever it is, right? I have to create this dynamic of distrust that you can only trust me. Well, for a lot of LGBTQ plus young people out of the foster care system, the reality is there aren't people in their lives that they can trust. They've been let down time and time and time again. When we send them to 7, 8, 9, 10, a young person that I just interviewed for a study, 15 different group homes and emergency shelters. One, we've reinforced every narrative that young person or that child probably created when they experience rejection or hostility or shame or betrayal from their family. And if the narrative is, I don't belong in a family, you can't trust people, people are eventually going to let you down, well, once they come into the foster care system and we can't provide them with a safe, secure family setting, whether we've intend to or not, I often say intentions really don't matter here. Whether we intended to or not, what we've done is we've corroborated the most harmful and hurtful and shameful narratives that those young people have created and constructed. We've reinforced every single one of them. The most harmful and the most hurtful one, that you don't belong in the family or that there's something wrong with you. So if they have this distrust, oftentimes it's for a good reason, but it's getting absolutely exploited by these perpetrators. And again, if I truly cannot trust people and I've been let down over and over and over again, this is a tactic that I'm going to be much more vulnerable to. Because for many kids, it's their reality. You just can't. People can't be trusted. And we've lost their trust as a system, as an institution, even as helpers. Let's look at the next one. Strategic use of shame and humiliation. This is again, if this is something that you knew in your family of origin or that you've experienced over and over and over again, when your pronouns aren't respected, or you're kicked out of a foster home, or you're bullied and teased and you're turned around and blamed for that, or folks refuse to treat you in the same way that they would treat non-LGBTQ kids, right? You internalize those experiences, right? Overwhelmed with shame, humiliation. And so now in that trauma bonding process, in that coercive control process, in that emotional isolation process, the use of shame and humiliation, which is always going to be there by these traffickers. They're always 15 steps ahead of everybody else, and they know how to use shame and past trauma and to create these superficial bonds. That's going to work a lot more. If you've been ruled by shame, we look at LGBT. I'm going to show you a study here in a second that LGBTQ plus young people from rejecting families are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide in childhood than those with affirming and authentic families that affirm them and accept them. 8 times more likely, 6 times almost more likely to meet clinical criteria for depression. What does that tell me as a social work professional? What does that tell me as a child welfare advocate? What does that tell me as a human being? It tells me that shame and hate and humiliation are working 8 and 6 times more in that child's life than it is for somebody who doesn't have those experiences. And you don't think that these traffickers who are so schooled and so equipped and so good at what they do in terms of trauma bonding and using coercive control and manipulating that shame and that humiliation, you don't think they don't know that? Of course they do. Right? They're acknowledging it in ways, right, in seeing it, in understanding it, oftentimes in ways that child welfare professionals and foster care professionals never managed to do. Wouldn't even name it for those young people, let alone tend to it. Exploiting trauma bonds, we've talked a little bit about that one. Exploiting financial destitution. If you're homeless, if you're broke, you got no money, you got no place to stay, you got no way to pay for gas or food or toiletries or whatever it might be, right? You're going to be much more vulnerable to these grooming tactics. So now what I want to do, I think that helps us to get a better sense of some of those vulnerabilities to trafficking beyond just, oh, we know that if you have a trauma history, you're more vulnerable. If you're in foster care, you're more vulnerable. If you're homeless, you're more vulnerable. Sure, but why? All right, and what is it about those trauma experiences that can make a young person so much more vulnerable? I think those are the things that we as social workers have really got to start thinking about, gang, in better understanding, in better tending to when we have the opportunity, when these young people first come on our radar, and that is simply not happening. So now let's look at those experiences for young people in foster care and maybe connect some of those dots. So as I said earlier, we know that there's a huge overrepresentation of LGBTQ plus young people. More vulnerable to maltreatment, more vulnerable to family rejection, more vulnerable to being kicked out of their homes, running away from hostile homes, coming on the radar from school officials, truancy officials for missing school, a whole host of factors that contribute to this vulnerability that make you much more likely to come into contact with child welfare professionals. And once you've come into contact with child welfare professionals, much more likely to be placed into foster care. But also their experiences all along the way are much different. So let's kind of walk through that process. So once a report is made, and this is pretty consistent from state to state with a little bit of variation, I understand that. But it typically kind of goes this way. A report is made, an investigation is conducted, and a determination is made on what needs to happen. And oftentimes that determination includes the decision whether the child stays with their family, which we know that LGBTQ plus young people are much more likely to remain in their family. And this is understandable because oftentimes we know that the factors that contributed to their separation from their family or their vulnerability to maltreatment had something to do with interactions with their family. So they're oftentimes not coming into care for a lot of the common reasons. We know that about 70% of kids who come into the foster care system are coming in for poverty-related neglect. That's oftentimes not the case for LGBTQ plus young people. Sure, they are experiencing abuse, especially emotional, rejection, maltreatment, at higher rates. So it would make sense that they're less likely to go with their family. I don't think that's too tough for us to understand. So what happens when a young person isn't able to go with their family of origin? All right, we typically look at kinship options. Who do we look at for kinship options? In some states, or a lot of states, right, we're pretty broad and we're pretty expansive in terms of who we might consider to be kinship. In other states, we pretty much stick to blood relatives. And so for a lot of LGBTQ young people, they create what we call fictive kinship networks. They have family, they have people that they can rely upon, people that they can trust, people who love them, people who are willing to take care of them, but it's not necessarily their biological family. It's oftentimes my literature teacher at school, or my best friend's parents, their family, right? So we really have to expand our definition and our understanding of kinship. And a lot of states give lip service to this, but they don't really do this, right? They don't really look beyond in meaningful ways. Hey, who are some folks that we can provide some resources to? And we know that for non-relative kinship caregivers, right, we typically have to offer them, right, some resources to take a young person in, especially with families being really strapped and really financially stressed right now in order to take care of another young person. But oftentimes we don't do that. We don't have an expansive understanding. We're not thinking outside of the box in terms of who constitutes a kinship, a fictive kinship network for young people. So then they're a lot less likely to go into kinship care. So then what do we say? What do we have to do now? Well, now it's foster care. What's the most desirable option at this point? If we can't reunite with the family, we can't send you to a kinship family member. Well, it's family foster care. And this is where we see some of the big disparities and differences in experiences. Now, in some states, again, we can pick on Texas, we simply don't have enough foster parents and foster caregivers for the number of kids that we have in care. We've had a problem that it seems like has been going on for a decade now, where young people are having to sleep in CPS offices and makeshift shelters and hotels, and this has changed forms and all sorts of different things over the course of the years. But it's basically boils down to we just don't have enough places for young people to go, but especially not enough family placements. So we just don't have enough placements in general, but we especially don't have family placements for LGBTQ plus youth because, one, what we know is a huge chunk of families simply are either not willing or not trained or equipped or able to provide affirming and accepting care to LGBTQ plus young people. Some states now have adopted what started here in Texas, these religious exception policies, where families simply do not have to provide affirming and accepting care to LGBTQ plus young people if providing that care conflicts with their what's referred to as strongly held religious beliefs. And what we know is in states where there's a strong relationship between faith-based foster care, a lot of foster homes are licensed through faith-based organizations and agencies, many of them that have religious teachings and convictions and theologies that are counter to acceptance and affirmation of LGBTQ plus young people. That's going to create a real gap in terms of the number of families who are trained and equipped and able and willing to provide affirming and accepting care. So oftentimes what will happen is a young person might get placed with a family, but then there's some conflict or some tension there. They're maybe not being treated the way that they should be treated, or the family's not comfortable with them in the home, or what I've seen in a number of young people that I've interviewed, the family are actively engaging in efforts to kind of change a young person's identity or sexual orientation, which you really can't do that, right? That just doesn't work. That's not a thing. And so then that creates these dynamics, perhaps where a young person might have tension and that leads to the family requesting them to leave, or the young person has tension with peers who are perhaps bullying them or mistreating them or excluding them, and then that creates some tension, or the young person runs from a family or asked to leave a family, or these 30-day requests are put in, which happens quite frequently for teenagers with LGBTQ identities in foster care, and then that now although they may have started in a family placement, now they're no longer in a family placement. And that doesn't work out. And then that kind of creates, and we all know this, right? That creates some labels for this young person. Wow, we put them with a family or perhaps two families, and they ran away, or they had tension with the foster parents, or they acted out in some sort of way with their peers. They got into an argument or a fight or something like that, and then that follows, right? That goes in the file, and that follows that young person. And so now what's happening is there's not enough family placements for youth, and now they got some labels. They've run away from some places, or they've picked up some diagnoses because of some of the behaviors that are oftentimes really less behaviors and more survival strategies. But now there's nobody willing to take them in, right? Because their level of care, right, or their level of need have intensified, even though it really hasn't. Nothing's really changed in them. We just didn't provide them with a safe, affirming, loving, warm, nurturing place in the first place, where this probably would have never happened had we done that, or if we would have placed them with those fictive kinship care providers in the first place. So now what are our options, right? It's group home, congregate care. Now, what we know about congregate care and group homes, in most states, this is the last place that we are supposed to send a young person. We're only supposed to send them there when there is no other family option for them. For LGBTQ plus youth, this is simply not their reality. Group home and congregate care have become the primary place where we place LGBTQ plus young people, but not where we place them, because they oftentimes will bounce and shuffle from one to another to another to another. And so here we have the least desirable, most institutional placement for a young person, the last place we're supposed to send them, that we're pretty much relying on for most LGBTQ plus youth, especially those with a family rejection history and youth of color. And again, what does that reinforce? When a kid ends up in a group home, they end up in a congregate care setting, they end up in a residential treatment center because it didn't work out in those families, oftentimes because those families were never a really good option, a place that we should have sent that young person in the first place, or those families simply were not equipped and trained and culturally competent and affirming and accepting to provide the type of care that this young person needed. But they've constructed these narratives, right? Children are narrative creatures. All of us are, but especially as kids. But I've noticed in 25 plus years working in the foster care system, kids in foster care are narrative creatures. They create stories to explain the world to themselves. And if the story is, I don't belong in the family, there is something wrong with me, or it's just normal for me to be treated this way, or this is what I deserve. Not only is that the narrative that a young person constructs and creates, but what happens with these narratives, and anybody who does trauma work knows this, and anybody who works with kids in foster care knows this, they construct these narratives, they construct these stories about the world, about themselves, and then they work like crazy to confirm those narratives and to corroborate those stories, to make them reality. Anyone who's worked with kids in foster care who have been perhaps had conflict with their family of origin, who have been separated from their family and have bounced around in foster care, oftentimes the narrative is, I don't belong, people are going to let me down. If you push hard enough, right, folks are gonna let you down. And so what do? They work like crazy to confirm that narrative. they push and they test boundaries and they try to get out in front of this stuff, because after all, I'm not going to sit back and wait for you to let me down, or for you to give up on me, or for you to disappoint me, or for you to decide that you don't want me anymore. I'm going to get out in front of that. Bruce Perry, who is a psychiatrist and a behavioral neuroscientist, and probably my favorite, or certainly the scholar that has probably influenced me the most, he has a quote in his first book that he wrote. It's called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and I recommend it to everybody. But the quote says that children, especially traumatized children, prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty. Meaning that they will go to incredible lengths to gain some sense of control, some sense of power, some sense of predictability over something that in their little minds, in their little nervous systems, is just inevitable. It's just going to happen. And so let's think about those narratives for LGBTQ kids in foster care, especially those who we send to group home and bounce from place to place to place to place, and we never provide them with permanency and safety. The narrative that they constructed in the family of origin is probably something around, I don't belong. Right? I could not fit in with my family, right? Or I was mistreated. I was rejected. So oftentimes, the narrative is there something wrong with me? So our job as child trauma professionals, as a child welfare system, would be obviously to heal those wounds and create experiences and relationships and pathways that would challenge and disrupt those narratives. At least you would hope, right? If the narrative is I don't belong in a family, our job would really be, let's get this kid connected with a family and make that work no matter what. But what do we do? Right? About with LGBTQ youth who have on average 7 placements while they're in foster care, who are much more likely to go congregate care. What we are doing is we are systematically, institutionally corroborating and confirming those narratives. We simply cannot allow that as a child welfare system, as a foster care system. Our job as trauma professionals, as the folks who are tasked with healing these wounds and providing permanency, is to heal those wounds and to provide permanency. It's certainly not to reinforce those narratives that are so harmful and that get internalized and lead to pain and shame and humiliation and anxiety and depression and traumatic stress and everything else. We cannot do that. So the over-reliance on congregate care, group home placement, that is a big problem in the foster care system and the child welfare system, and one that we really have to get out in front of and do something about, because I think we're doing a lot of damage and a lot of harm to these young people. As somebody who's conducted a lot of qualitative studies and has interviewed hundreds of LGBTQ plus youth out of the foster care system. Less likely to be placed with their siblings, certainly less likely to be adopted out of care as well. We see far more placement disruptions, about 2.5 times more placement disruption. So if you're an LGBTQ plus young person right now in a foster placement, a child welfare placement, you're about 2.5 times more likely for that placement to disrupt at some point than if you're not LGBTQI plus. When we look at LGBTQ youth with a history of foster care, they have about 3 times greater odds of reporting a suicide attempt in the past year compared to LGBTQ plus youth who never went into foster care in the first place. So the experience of foster care increases your odds for LGBTQ kids of attempting suicide by 3 times. I think for a lot of us as social workers, we see this and we realize these things simply are not acceptable. And then, as we talked about earlier, 60% of sex trafficking victims who are under the age of 25 years old have a history of child welfare system, including foster care, many of them with foster care history. And that's for LGBTQ plus young people. So, as I always tell my students, no training is worth taking if there aren't tangible things that I can do and learn and know the second that I finish this training. So let's talk about some trauma-informed strategies that I think would be really, really helpful if we're working with LGBTQ plus young people who are in the foster care system or at risk of being in the foster care system. First, let's operationalize trauma here. I'm gonna rely very heavily on another author who's had a huge influence on me. Many of you have heard of him. He's very popular. It's Gabor Mate. Gabor Mate is a physician and a trauma author and a healer and a guru out of Vancouver, British Columbia. Survivor of the Holocaust, and he has done a lot of work in the area of substance abuse and addiction. But he has a definition of trauma that I think is perhaps more helpful in terms of understanding and helping to heal the wounds for LGBTQ plus youth than any other population I can think of. All right. And when we think about trauma, we oftentimes, when I ask my new students in social work especially, I say, what is trauma? What is child trauma? And they'll say, well, it's abuse. It's physical abuse or witnessing domestic violence. And I'll say, yeah, that's really, really helpful. But that's not trauma, because trauma, childhood trauma, is not what happens to a young person. That's the traumatic event or the traumatic relationship or the traumatic experience. That's not the trauma. The trauma, rather, is what happens inside of a young person because of the bad things that have happened to them. And so the reason that I like this operationalization, this definition of trauma so much, one, it's absolutely accurate. And as somebody who is a survivor of child trauma, I had a father who was just awful and who was an alcoholic and a narcissist and was really, really bad. The trauma was not having an alcoholic father, right, or the things that he did to me or the dynamics that existed in our relationship. The trauma were all of the changes that I experienced, both in my nervous system, in my body, the way that I carried that, but also all of the adaptations, all of the things that I did in an effort to try to attach to him, to keep him in my life, to keep him calm, and to pacify him, and to tend to his needs, and to keep safe, and to make sense of all of this, the narratives that I constructed about myself and about him and about the world and about trust and about people. That's the trauma. Trauma is not what happens to us. It's what happens inside of us because of what happens to us. And the reason that I like that is, if you're a survivor of child trauma, or you work with survivors of child trauma like kids in foster care, you can never not change what they've been through. If they've experienced domestic violence or family separation or abuse or trafficking, you can never change that reality. You can never make it to where they have not had those experiences. That's just the raw, tough truth. But the fact that that's not the trauma was all of the things that happened inside of them, all of the things that they did to adapt and attach and survive those experiences. That's the trauma. Well, we can heal those wounds. We can tend to those. We can acknowledge those experiences. We can disrupt those neural pathways and create new ones. Right? We can replace relationships and connections and experiences and create new ones that are healing and transformative and regulating for them. So I think this understanding of trauma is especially beneficial for LGBTQ plus youth, and I want to expand it a little bit here. And go beyond. Trauma is not just what happens inside of a young person because of what has happened to them and how they've adapted to that and survived that, but it's also what happens inside of them because of the good things that don't happen for them. And for a lot of LGBTQ kids, especially with their family of origin, especially those who dealt with rejection and who dealt with isolation and shame and silence, in many instances, their trauma is as much or more about the good things that didn't happen for them as it is about the bad things that did happen to them. family separation, placement in foster care, kicked out of the home, running away, that sort of stuff. And we, as trauma-informed child welfare professionals, school social workers, therapists, whatever your role is, we have to understand that reality about trauma. It's every bit as much about the good things that don't happen to you as the bad things that do happen to you. And our job is to create opportunities for the good things to now happen for these young people. If you didn't have a safe, secure, loving, nurturing family, it is our job to give you a safe, secure, loving, nurturing family. If you didn't experience authenticity and affirmation and acceptance in your family of origin, it is our job to provide you with folks who will give you that affirmation and that acceptance and create an environment where you can be authentic and you can be who you were made to be. If you went to schools where you were mistreated and you were bullied and you were harassed, or your pronouns weren't respected, it is our job to provide you with educational experiences where you get those things respected and you're treated and you're educated and you're affirmed. So if trauma is every bit as much about the good things that don't happen to you, it's our job, to give young people those experiences, those relationships, those connections. Oh yeah, here, I meant to have this slide up while I talked about those things. Sorry about that. There's another framework that I think is equally as helpful for us if we're thinking about tangible things or approaches that we can take to understanding and tending to the experiences of LGBTQ youth. And this again comes from Gabor Mate. This is perhaps one of my favorite frameworks, and the one as a social work educator that I use maybe more than any other. And Mate talks about how, and every one of us in this training knows this first part, how important attachment is. Attachment. There's a reason why, especially those of you who work with children and youth, those of you who have social work credentials, you've studied attachment so much. The most studied phenomenon in child development for very good reason. It's really, really important. In fact, it's non-negotiable. It is absolutely essential to our survival. So I got a picture up here of a little baby with a briefcase. It always cracks me up. But I want to imagine for a second, imagine this is my kid. And he just turned, about 1 year old. He's standing up there. He looks like he's about 1 year old. And I'm having his 1 year old birthday, and I say, okay, little Adam, you've had a good run. You and I have had a good run together. Here's a hat and a sweater vest and a briefcase and some slick shoes. You get out there and you go make it happen, buddy. Right? And don't you forget to call home. Here's a bus pass. Don't forget to call home and check in with your mom and I. That would be ridiculous, right? But I use this illustration to help us understand how important attachment is. He wouldn't survive 2 seconds out there on his own. He needs me, right? He needs me. And my job as a parent was the most important thing for me to do as a parent. I tell this to parents all the time, especially CPS. Your most important job as a parent, the trick to this thing as a parent, is to help this young person to know that this attachment, what you get from me, my affirmation, my nurture, tending to your needs, my pride, my attention, this thing is non-negotiable. You do not earn it. You can't lose it. You can't, right? You just get it because you are you. And that's attachment. He doesn't survive 2 seconds without it. He needs it. And he's going to do everything that he has to do in his power to get it. My job is to make sure that he knows he doesn't have to do anything to get it. Now, there's another experience phenomenon in child development that I would argue, and certainly Gabor Mate, who I've adopted this framework from, would oftentimes contend that is equally as important to his well-being, and as he gets older, I would suggest to his survival, and that's authenticity, the capacity to fully embrace, right, your authentic self. When we think about authenticity, I oftentimes think about it as nature's agenda for us. This is simply who we were made to be. So what does our authentic self make up? Certainly our emotions. We have to have the full or have the environment in the capacity to experience and express in safe ways the full range of emotions. If I'm shy and timid, I'm going to be invited and celebrated for being kind of shy and timid. If I got big feelings and big emotions, I'm going to be celebrated and invited to have those big emotions. I do a lot of work with males on masculinity and trauma in foster homes and group homes and in prisons, youth prisons. For many of them, what we learn in every single group, every single time about right away is many of them, when they were very young, they had feelings of fear and vulnerability and sensitivity and sadness and shame and all of these sorts, but they realized very quick that those emotions simply were not okay. And so they converted them to something else, typically anger or humor, or they just shut off from them altogether, their feelings and their emotions. And here they are, 15, 16, 17 years old, completely detached from their authentic feelings, except for shame, or except for anger and humor, which oftentimes, in the way that they express them, are not their authentic feelings. It's what they've converted their authentic feelings of pain and vulnerability and hurt and fear and sadness and shame into. And then they act out on that, obviously. And we can almost always, especially for youth in prison, trace back why they're in there, what they did to that detachment, that trauma. Our needs are housed in this authentic self. What we need from the world, but especially what we need from our caretakers, our parents. Our capacity to express those needs in a safe way and expect them to be met. It's my job as a parent to recognize, right, if my kid is tired, they need rest. And if they tell me they need rest, or they tell me they're tired, I need to make sure they get rest. Or if they're sad or hurt or scared, to console them, or whatever it might be. Our needs, our emotions, our identity, right, as we get a little bit older, right, these are all things that make up our authentic self. And just as it's seminal, right, absolutely essential that a young person grows up in an environment where their attachment is non-negotiable, that they get it no matter what, they can't earn it, they can't lose it, it's equally as important for a young person's health and wellness and safety and mental health and well-being to grow up in environments where they are fully celebrated and invited to be exactly who they were made to be, to embrace their authentic self. Now, here's the rub. Here's the tension here, what Gabor Mate refers to as the traumatic tension, especially for a lot of LGBTQ plus young people. Their attachment is threatened by their authenticity, especially their identity, especially their sexuality, especially their emotions, how they express themselves, their needs. And when this tension exists, who do you think wins? Attachment or authenticity? And I'll give you a hint. Think of our little baby here with the briefcase. Almost every single time, as Mate says, attachment is going to trump authenticity. After all, I need it to survive. I don't last out in the world without it. So what does a young person do? They disconnect from that authentic self. They disconnect from those authentic parts. They disconnect from those feelings and those emotions. They disconnect from those needs. They disconnect from that identity, or at least they try to, or they cover it up, or they mask it, or they try to separate from it, or they hide it. And at its core, trauma is a disconnection from the self. Now, easy to understand this with experiences of things like physical abuse, domestic violence. Myself couldn't keep me safe. I had this experience where there's so much shame, so much pain. What's much more prevalent, especially in the experiences of LGBTQ plus youth with rejecting family experiences, is the disconnection from their authentic self that is rooted in that rejection that they experience. Growing up in environments where their authentic self threatened their existence. So life for many of them, childhood for many of them, both prior to when they came under care and certainly after they were in care, was just this series of detachment, right? Disconnect from their authentic self, right? And for many of them, they're completely divorced from it. And it becomes really, really hard for them to connect. So what is a trauma-informed strategy for me as a social worker? Something that I really need to focus my efforts and my relationship on is helping to recognize what are those parts that a young person disconnected to or disconnected with, and how do we help to restore them, right? Because here's the thing about the authentic self. It leaves us. I mean, we leave it. Sorry. We leave it. It doesn't leave us. All right. Trauma-informed work with LGBTQ plus youth in foster care, young people who are homeless, kids in foster care just in general oftentimes, right, is so much about helping them to connect with those authentic parts that they had at one point in time to disconnect from or to detach from. And I promise you, if we're just bouncing them from group home to group home to group home and never establishing the family connections in the relationships where this would happen for them, where this reconnection, right, this reunification with their authentic self would happen, what's happening is they're further disconnecting from those parts, because right, the same survival, and this is a problem, the same survival strategies that they had to employ in order to survive in their family of origin that may have been or that oftentimes was rejecting or hostile or volatile, the same survival strategies that they needed then, they need now to survive in the foster care system. That is not okay. We should not have in the system that is supposed to heal the wounds of the trauma that you've experienced, you should not need the same survival strategies now that you needed then. This is simply not okay. There's one more thing here that I wanted to mention before that I didn't. And that's for us to remember that young people don't so much remember the trauma that they've experienced, rather they relive the adaptations that they had to employ in order to survive it, or in order to endure it, or in order to make sense of it, or in order to attach in the midst of it. And that's what I'm kind of talking about here. We shouldn't require young people, right, to need the same survival strategies that they needed in a rejecting or hostile family, one that they had to run from, or that they were kicked out of, or that was so toxic and abusive that they were removed from. They shouldn't need those same strategies. And this goes for all youth in foster care. This isn't, I mean, obviously it's a little bit, maybe more common for LGBTQ plus youth, but this goes for any kids in foster care. You shouldn't need, and for social workers in general, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but we shouldn't need the same survival strategies in our work, perhaps people pleasing, right? Or never saying no to something, or never setting a boundary, if that was something that we needed in childhood. I do want to talk a little bit about the family acceptance study here. This study is about 15 years old. It's as relevant, or perhaps more relevant today, as it's ever been. This is a study done by a team of researchers in San Francisco that were really looking at the family experiences of LGBTQ plus young people, more so than simply just looking at their identity as a predictor of things like suicide and depression and behavioral health risks like risky sex and risky substance abuse. So they did a series of studies kind of capturing or operationalizing what a young person's experiences look like around acceptance and affirmation. Really, the way that I like to think about it is, how well did their family do at celebrating and inviting them to be who they were made to be? Acceptance and affirmation. And they looked at a host of things. How did your family tend to, if you were being bullied or teased at school, how did they engage in conversations about your identity? How did they approach romantic relationships and all of that sort of stuff? And they gave a score ranging from very rejecting all the way to very accepting. And what they found was that those young people in very accepting, affirming families were actually 8 times less likely to attempt suicide in childhood than those who were in highly rejecting families, in families where they couldn't be authentic. Same thing, those in really, really accepting families were 5.9 times, almost 6 times less likely to meet clinical criteria for major depressive disorder than those who were in rejecting families. 3.5 times less likely to engage in risky behaviors like risky sex and risky substance abuse with an accepting and affirming family than with the rejecting families. That what they found was acceptance and affirmation, growing up in a home where you were celebrated and invited to be who you were made to be, actually buffered you from all of these things. That in fact, young people who grow up with young people with LGBTQ identities who grow up in affirming and accepting homes are no more likely to attempt suicide or have depression or engage in risky behaviors than non-LGBTQ plus young people. And why would they? And I told you earlier, when we talked about that tension between attachment and authenticity, why attachment oftentimes trumps authenticity, because after all, it's necessary for survival. But let's look at this study and talk about how necessary for survival for many LGBTQ plus young people, especially those who are vulnerable to going into the foster care system, how rooted their survival is in authenticity. If you are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide if you're in a rejecting family than an accepting family, your authenticity is absolutely essential and necessary for your safety and your survival. And this is especially the case for trans kids, especially trans kids of color right now, who are the most vulnerable population in the entire United States to attempting and dying by suicide. Whether your state allows you to talk about it or not, that doesn't change the reality for those young people. Oh, here's that quote there. You don't so much remember the trauma as much as you relive the adaptations that you used to survive it and endure it. I think this is so important for us to understand when we look at the behaviors of LGBTQ plus young people. I teach my social work students this all the time. Our work as social workers is so much about not focusing on what is wrong with you and what you need to fix or what you need to change. Rather, our work is rooted in understanding what has happened to you and what are the strategies and the tactics that you had to, at one point in your time, have to employ and use in order to survive, and in order to attach, and in order to survive, in order to endure. And oftentimes what you will find is that the behaviors, especially those that are deemed the most problematic or the most pathological, a term that we use quite frequently now with kids in foster care, which is a pretty wild thought to me. These behaviors are not pathological. These behaviors, you're much better understanding them if you understand that these aren't so much pathological behaviors as they are survival strategies. And instead of asking what is wrong with you now, or what is wrong with this behavior now, perhaps what we can do as trauma-informed professionals is ask ourselves or ask these young people what was right about it then. Because oftentimes, whether it's testing boundaries or pushing the limits, right, or running away or being loud and yelling and screaming in order to be seen and heard or acknowledged in some sort of way, right? It's not some pathological thing that they're doing now. It's something that they had to do then to survive or attach or get attention or to keep safe. And I think that's our work as social workers, to shift from, and it's tough in a system like the child welfare system where we are just so, and always have been, so pathological in terms of how we understand families and how we understand kids. And it's really the only thing that can explain how the heck it is that we would bounce traumatized kids who have been separated from their families, who have dealt with unimaginable trauma. It's the only thing that can explain how it is that we bounce them from place to place to place, and how it is that we pathologize them and label them and over-medicate them and separate them from their brothers and their sisters and do all of the things that we get away with doing in this system. because we oftentimes have little appreciation and little understanding and little sensitivity to what we know has happened to them, and little curiosity around what has happened to them, and appreciation and understanding for the survival strategies that they employ every day. We call this traumatic wisdom. We need a lot more of it in a lot of our systems, but especially the foster care system. As children, we always do. If there's one thing that I've learned in 25 years of working with kids in foster care, if there's one thing that I wish everybody out there knew, as children, we always do, and some of us can think about this in the context of our own childhoods, we always do exactly what we needed to do to survive, to attach, to adapt, to endure. There is wisdom in that. And I worry that for a lot of kids in foster care, especially for LGBTQ kids, we are not seeing the wisdom in the survival, in the resilience, and the resourcefulness in these behaviors. We view them as problematic, deficits, pathological. And that's how we get the pipelines, and that's how we get the over-reliance on group homes, and that's how we get a dynamic where kids are in these pipelines to trafficking and in institutions, into prisons, into homelessness. It's not working for us. I would encourage all of us to look at this a different way, to approach this work in a different way. We've already talked about the narrative nature, and we've already talked about this quote, but I think it's a really, really good one, probably worth mentioning again. Bruce Perry, my all-time favorite quote in working with youth in the foster care system, and their families and their parents as well, right? But we prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty. If a young person has lost control, either because of experiences of abuse and rejection and hostility, and they come into care and we've systematically taken more control and more power from them in terms of removing them or bouncing them from place to place, from school to school, separating them from their peers and their connections and their relationships. They prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty every single time. What are the things that these young people are doing to regain some sense of power, some sense of control? Where is the wisdom in that behavior? Where is the survival in that behavior? And I'll close with this quote from Bessel van der Kolk. Everybody knows, the author of The Body Keeps the Score. He says, "Trauma can make the world into a gathering of aliens." When I think about this quote, I think about the two loneliest populations I've ever met in my entire life. And that's one, teenagers in foster care, oftentimes LGBTQ youth waiting family placement or permanency or connection that more times than not will never come for them. Certainly not in childhood. In the second most lonely population, they're social workers and they're caseworkers. And you can be surrounded by people, right? In these two populations, youth in foster care and their caseworkers oftentimes are surrounded by people all day long. Conversations, phone calls, texts, meetings, kids in group homes. Hey, sometimes there's 8, 10, 12 other kids living in that home. But the trauma that they've experienced, especially the trauma of family rejection in foster care placement, and having these experiences where you feel entirely unseen, unheard, nobody truly understands, names your trauma, names your experience, takes the time to get to know it, to see all of the things that you're doing to try to survive it, all of the wisdom in your behaviors, right? That can turn the world into a gathering of aliens. The only thing that can counterbalance the effects of adversity and childhood trauma and family separation and placement into foster care and family rejection, right, are relationships, connection. And for so many LGBTQ plus young people, we simply aren't delivering those relationships in that sense of connection for them. This is how we heal trauma, especially the trauma of family rejection. This is how we disrupt and create new narratives, through relationships, through connection, right? Through putting people in that young person's life who can affirm and accept them and invite them and celebrate them for who they were made to be, right? Who can understand what's behind their behaviors, even if they're pushing limits and testing boundaries, to see the wisdom and see the survival in that, to be there for them, to be someone that they can trust, someone who can keep them safe, someone who takes the time to see them and hear them and understand them, and someone who recognizes that the only thing worse than to experience the trauma of family rejection and family separation and foster care is to experience that trauma all alone. In doing so many studies now with LGBTQ plus young people, I think the one of the biggest tragedies is not so much that these kids experience so much trauma. Sure, that's a tragedy, and that's not okay. But they're experiencing it alone. They're experiencing without anyone there for them. Right? And the only thing worse than to experience trauma is to experience it alone. So I hope that we can take some of these strategies and take this understanding and apply it to our work with youth in foster care and LGBTQ plus youth in foster care or in schools or homeless youth programs or whatever it might be. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you tuning in today.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post-test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.